Today, we are particularly pleased to recognize, as part of our Tea and Art History, Mary Jane Bowen Graff, who is with us today. And I don't know if you want to stand. Mary Jane has been a devoted volunteer and supporter of arts and culture for more than 5 decades. She was instrumental in the development of the first docent program at NSU Art Museum in 1970, and this program is really going strong, so you have an incredible legacy here. Ms. Graff is a charter member of Beaux-Arts and a longtime Beaux-Arts board member, another auxiliary group that we couldn't do without. These women do an amazing job raising money for the museum's education programs. And their fundraising luncheon is going to be next month. And it's going to be very successful. And this, again, is a great legacy that you have made possible. Through the advocacy of arts and culture, Ms. Graff's family had a profound impact on the community, which led to establishing the museum as we know it today. Her father was a collector and loved art, and as she told me at lunch, he said, "This town needs an art museum," and he made it happen. So we're thrilled that this again is your family's legacy. And her father, Stephen Bowen, was also the founder and first president of the museum. So we are very fortunate to have Mary Jane Bowen Graff with us today. Mary Jane, would you be able to come up and we could give you our appreciation. So this is a certificate of recognition and an appreciation for all that you have done all these many years for the museum. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here and to receive this prestigious award. And more than that, it's a pleasure to see this beautiful museum, because I remember it when it was a storefront at a hardware store on Los Olas Boulevard. And we've come a long way since then. So it's really an honor for me to be able to receive this award.
Thank you such, Mary Jane. Thank you. We take a picture. Oh, you're a shadow. Let's stand up. Maybe we'll go over, get out of the way of the light.
You're going to get that screen.
All right, who else wants to direct it?
All right, I'll three. 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce a very dear friend of mine. The world-famous art educator, recognized since 1980 in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most prolific art teacher in the world. Connie Gordon got her start as an art educator when she was a Marine. Yes, a Marine during World War II. So that tells you just the kind of lady she is. She had to go through the same training, she's told me, as the men. So we know she's filled with incredible grit. And she was asked, she taught the art to the soldiers, to the military, with the idea that this would help normalize their lives during the war. So she was really at the forefront of art therapy. So we have a great trailblazer here. Ms. Gordon received her formal training in the visual arts and philosophy at Columbia University in New York, so we have that in common. And she studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in France. In 2000, when she has gone on to be a television personality right at the beginning of television, where she was one of the first of the artists to teach painting on television. You could also catch her if you go on YouTube to see many times she appeared on the Johnny Carson exhibition, Johnny Carson show, David Letterman, and the Bonnie Hunt show. And if you ever need a really good laugh, watch these. They are really fantastic as she teaches these celebrities how to be artists. In 2014, Connie made an extraordinary gift to the museum that proudly launched the Connie Gordon Art of Teaching Art Symposium, dedicated to presenting innovative methods in art education for all ages. And in 2016, she made a major legacy gift to the museum in support of educational programming. Thank you so much, Connie, for making sure the museum has a great future. I'd like to now, are you able to come up, bring up? All right, we'll come over here. We've already learned our lesson.
Sit in my lap.
Oh, sit in my lap. So, Connie, this certificate is recognition and appreciation of your support and your friendship. Thank you so much. Would you like to say a few words?
Yes. Number one, as an artist, you see my picture in your brochure. I have the right to change the color anytime I want. No, seriously, it's an honor to be associated with the wonderful people who are involved with this organization, this educational place where you can improve yourself. And I'm delighted to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. I love you too, Connie. Thank you. And I should mention that as part of our 60th anniversary, one of the things we are going to be focusing on is building endowment for the museum, so that now that we're really on a roll, it's had a great history, now we're on a roll. In order for this museum to really thrive in the future, the aim is for real financial stability. And legacy gifts such as the one that Connie has established for the museum will help make that happen. And wink, wink, we hope all of you start thinking about how you can be part of that legacy for this museum that you all love, for the community that you love, to make sure that we are always going to be here as a vibrant center of culture for the South Florida community, and especially for Broward and Fort Lauderdale. So again, thank you, Connie, for getting the ball rolling. And unfortunately, Marie Iandoli was not able to join us today. She took ill, but she too has been involved with the museum and with Southeastern University since 1976, when she managed a training program for protective social workers. Ms. Iandoli became involved with the museum in 1982 as an active docent. She is a devoted philanthropist, who has donated her time and support to numerous arts and culture organizations in Broward County, including the Children's Museum, the Pompano Library, and the Museum of Discovery. Her other great passion is education. She has established numerous scholarships for students in master's and doctorate programs at universities, including Florida Atlantic University and University of Miami. These are three dynamic, devoted women who have made a huge impact on this museum and the community and the world. So thank you all, our honorees, for today. And you will be hearing more about the 60th. And if any of you have memories to to share with us. We are trying to gather all of the memories about the museum. I talked to one of the former directors on Friday, George Bulgy. It was his birthday. We go way back. He's all excited, and he's looking forward to helping us with our celebration of the 60th. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Barbara Buhler Lynes, who is the Kaufman Senior Curator at the museum, is one of the most distinguished art historians today. We're very fortunate that she is part of the museum. She is the foremost expert on Georgia O'Keeffe. She was the founding curator of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. She wrote the catalogue raisonné of Georgia O'Keeffe at the National Gallery that was published by Yale. And she was the founding director of the Georgia O'Keeffe Research Center. That doesn't mean she only knows Georgia O'Keeffe, but she is an expert in that field. Dr. Lynes is also a well-known art historian educator. She was a professor of art history and chair of the art history department at Maryland Institute College of Art. And she held positions as assistant professor of art history at Dartmouth College and Vanderbilt University. She holds a PhD in art history from Indiana University and another PhD in French literature from the University of California, Riverside. This is obviously someone that likes to stay busy, and we keep her very busy here. When she helped me organize the exhibition of Marty Margulies' collection of photography 2 years ago, I asked Marty Margulies, have you met Barbara Lynes? And he said, you mean that woman who, except for her white hair, I thought she was a 19-year-old? So she does have this incredible energy, and among other things she's working on right now is a major exhibition that will be the grand finale of our 60th anniversary, which is the art of William Glackens, who, as you all know, is a big collection at the museum, and Renoir. Renoir was a major influence on Glackens, but this has never been studied in any great depth. And Dr. Lynes is doing an amazing job really examining this, and we are going to have one amazing exhibition opening November 2019, which will then travel to Paris, to the Musée de Montmartre, and we will have another big event there. So it just keeps going on and on. So please welcome the very talented, very busy Dr. Barbara Buhler Lynes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon. And Bonnie, thank you for that lovely introduction. Bonnie and I are having a great time working together. We enjoy many of the same things. Her expertise is on contemporary, really from the 1970s to the present, and mine is from the 1870s to the 1970s. So we complement each other pretty well. I am going to talk to you, first I'm going to take out this cough drop, and then I'm going to talk to you about two famous artist couples, Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, and Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. And I've put the dates that they were born and died up here for you, so you get a sense that they're pretty much of the same period, of the same generations. The youngest, of course, is Kahlo, who was born in 1907. And what I'm going to talk about today is the differences and similarities between their careers and how and why, what Bonnie mentioned, the two women are more well known today. than their previously more celebrated husbands. It's an interesting phenomenon. I'm going to show you one of the reasons that that occurs. So you have these differences in their ages in terms of OKeeffe being 23 years younger than Stieglitz, and Frida Kahlo being 21 years different. She was 21 years younger than Mr. Rivera. So both of them married older men, and both older men were very well established. Their marriages were very cordial in many ways. They loved each other and admired each other greatly. These are candid snapshots of OKeeffe and Stieglitz, and candid snapshots of Diego and Frida, and they also had quite passionate relationships. And these are pictures that were made of them kissing one another. Rivera and Kahlo had numerous affairs during their marriage. They were divorced and remarried, and Stieglitz loved OKeeffe as well as another woman. As of the early 1930s, her name was Dorothy Norman, but he and OKeeffe never divorced. They reached an agreement by which Stieglitz managed to carry on this affair, and it was suited OKeeffe because she wanted to be in New Mexico, and Dorothy was in New York. And it meant that Dorothy would take care of Stieglitz while OKeeffe was in New Mexico, and that suited both of them very well. Now, first I want to show you a work by Diego Rivera. And I want you to know that he first married Frida in 1928. And you see here an oil painting by Diego that is very well known with these Kahlo lilies. But he's most famous for his depictions of different kinds of political frescoes in Mexico City. And you see here this history of Mexico from the conquest to the future, which was done in 1929 to 1930, and it's in Mexico City. And he was so well known in Mexico that he was then invited to the United States, where he made frescoes in various places, such as in Detroit and New York City. And I think you're all aware of the Rockefeller Center fresco that include images of Lenin and was destroyed because of that. Now, I have an image of them at their wedding, and both weddings, one in 1929 when she was 22, and another after they divorced and then were remarried in 1940. So you see them here at different points in time. And a portrait of them that was made by Kahlo some years after they were first married. This is 1931. And as you know, she was inflicted with polio as a child. And she suffered a severe traffic accident in 1925. So this is 6 years after that traffic accident. And that happened when she was 18. And that traffic accident caused a railing from the bus that she was in to dislodge and penetrate her body. And she really never fully recovered from that. She began painting while she was convalescing, but the point I'm making is that her life was dominated by the pain she endured from 1918 until her death. And you can see she's a fairly diminutive figure next to Diego as they stand here, he with his paints and palette in his hand, and she in a shawl and a typical Mexican dress. This is what I mean by the nature of her pain. And here we're looking at her in one of the devices, or at least this could be an imagined device also, that she had to wear to support her body while she was recovering from the many, many operations that she endured during her life. She longed to live pain-free and to be able to give birth to a child by Diego Rivera. That was one of her passions. And unfortunately, she was unable to realize that and suffered a number of miscarriages. And she is unique in the sense that she's one of the first artists to portray that pain and that personal involvement with pain. So here you see her in this image, Henry Ford Hospital in 1932, where she had one of her miscarriages. So although these paintings are now riveting to us, they were hardly known during her lifetime. And she only became really popular in the late 70s to the present. And shortly after, Linda Nochlin, a famous art historian, asked a very simple question and answered it in an article that she wrote for Art News in 1970. And that question was, why have there been no great women artists? And when I went to graduate school and undergraduate school and took art history courses, there were no women in the art history textbooks. Now, what I mean is that there were no women artists. Their works were not represented in the textbooks. There were plenty of women in the textbooks, but they had been painted by men, and most of them were nudes. And it was a theme in Western art really from the 16th century, and something that interested all of us. And of course, we merrily went along with all this without really having a voice or the words for saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why have there been no great artists? And of course, Kahlo's work and that of many artists came into view, many women artists came into view as a result of that question. Scholars began to examine Kahlo's work. They recognized the innovative character of her willingness to present her personal experiences, the subjects of her paintings. Her paintings are colorful, they're graphically precise, and they're nearly clinical in some ways, that they engage and provoke us. And they remain the same in terms of style, in my opinion, throughout her lifetime. Others are compelling in what they tell us about the conflict within her and between her need to assert herself and how she often felt trapped or immobilized by her deep feelings for Diego Rivera. And this was one of my favorite paintings in the exhibition that we had several years ago when the Gelman Foundation collection was here and in part on view at the museum. I stood in front of this painting for a very, very long time, many hours. It's a portrait of her in a typical dress that's traditional to Tijuana, and that is in an area of Oaxaca, in southern Mexico. Now, this was an area in Mexico and remains an area in Mexico that is a matriarchal structure. So she associates herself by wearing this dress with that matriarchal structure and with strong and authoritative women, and she stares directly at us. Yet she is obsessed at the same time by her love for Rivera, whose portrait fills her forehead. The vein-like web of thin lines that radiates from her head throughout the composition locks her into it, in my opinion. In other words, she's unable to escape. In spite of her assertive boldness, she seems trapped and incapable of freeing herself. She truly loved Diego, and in such a way that she was compromised in her ability to be, in some ways, who she was as an individual. Or as she later explained it herself, she said, "I suffered 2 grave accidents in my life. One involved a bus, and the other is Diego." Now, Nochlin argued that there had been no great women artists because the educational system through the ages was not open to women. And that's true. It was only in the 1870s in this country that women were allowed to go to various professional schools, such as art school or medical school. And O'Keeffe benefited from attending art school. And of course, I think many of you know that Kahlo wanted to be a doctor and began her career in medicine. That was before the bus accident occurred, which severely compromised her future. O'Keeffe's story, however, is very different from Kahlo's, and I wanted to show you this too, because it shows her face exactly as it looks. She paints herself realistically, staring out at us. This is a portrait of her, a photograph of her, and then this image with Diego in her forehead, and you can see it there. Now, OKeeffe is a very different story, and I will demonstrate its trajectory, however, is also related to the 1970s and the feminist movement of that decade. Like Kahlo, OKeeffe was married to an important artist, and Stieglitz was famous not only for his contribution to photography, and I'm showing you one of his photographs, which is called The Steerage. This is from 1907. He was very famous for a photographic approach called straight photography. And straight photography is an approach to photography that does not involve the manipulation of the negative or of the print during the process of printing the print. In other words, a photographer can do a lot to create an atmosphere and create various things when he or she is making an image, especially before the digital age of photography. And that is, they could scratch on the negatives, they could scratch on the papers, they could wave different objects over the papers while they were exposing them to light. There are various ways that they could manipulate the image. And Stieglitz felt that this was not honoring the nature of photography as a mechanism. And of course, the reason the photographers had tried to do that was because photography was thought of as a mechanical process. And it wasn't really until the 1980s, 70s, 80s in this country that it's been understood as art. So Stieglitz was a promoter of the idea of photography as art. And he believed that one shouldn't manipulate in the darkroom when you are making a print. Rather, the artistry is in the artist. So the artistry lies in the person who's standing with the camera and looking through it. And Stieglitz rarely manipulated any of his images. So this is called straight photography because he's not doing anything to the image. And of course what he's doing is shifting the idea of the artist from someone who's manipulating something in the darkroom to the photographer who is standing behind the camera, which is a very important development in the history of photography. Now, these are, here we are, images. This is an image of Stieglitz, just to show you what he was like. He's quite a character, very outspoken. OKeeffe said that one time when she was interviewed by someone that listening to him go on and on and on, and he did, on and on and on in his galleries, was like being beaten around the body with sandbags. She had a great sense of humor about things like that. Here he is on the left in a snapshot with his camera, one of his cameras. He had many cameras, and another of him that he made himself, this self-portrait from 1907. And it wasn't too long after this that Stieglitz met OKeeffe. So he was nearly 53 when he met her, and she was 26. Now, he was different from his contemporaries in a very fundamental way, most of whom dismissed modern art as irrelevant. He was a supporter not only of photography, but of modern art, and was really the first American to show examples of modern art at his gallery 291. But he also was important because he believed that women could make art equal to the work that men had already produced. Now, that's not such a big issue today, although it still remains an issue. But at the time, there was a belief within the scientific community that Stieglitz did not believe, and that is that the human body had finite fluids. In other words, we have fluids within us that are finite, such as our blood and urine and so forth, right? So we have these finite fluids. And the idea was that if a person lost too much of these finite fluids, they would no longer be able to propagate. So it was a real threat to the future of humanity for the human body to lose vital fluids. Now, you could use your vital fluids up, and women were in a position to lose more of them than men because of lactation and menstruation. So it made sense that if women exercised their minds, which is another component of using up some of these vital fluids, that their vital fluids might get used up, and they wouldn't be able to propagate and carry on the species. Now, Stieglitz had one foot in the 20th century, when, of course, that notion no longer held, in the sense that he believed women could distinguish themselves in all fields. And he was really interested in finding a woman who would be an important artist. And he had a foot in the 19th century because he felt that women would then express in their work their sexual nature. He believed in all art as an expression of human sexuality. He talked this way about the men, and he certainly talked this way about OKeeffe. But the only person it clung to was George OKeeffe. And he took this series of photographs of her, and of course, he was famous for this series of photographs of her. It's another example of her in 1919, posing in the nude, and many of them completely in the nude, and sometimes her work was the backdrop of these photographs. So he associated her image and her body with her work, and that's an ongoing phenomenon in the current histories of art, that her body then becomes the subject of her work in the same way that Kahlo makes her own body the subject of her work. The difference is that OKeeffe objected to this, and she objected strongly to this because she believed that she was expressing aspects of the sexuality of the natural world. Now you're looking at this moment at one of her early abstractions, and this is from 1918, and it is an abstraction that is probably based on her looking at a plant form of some sort, or a wave of water. And what Stieglitz did when he showed these abstractions, and these abstractions, many of them date from the teens, 1910s, 1916 to 1920, pretty much, he promoted these abstractions as manifestations of her sexuality. And he promoted her as a kind of sex queen. In other words, he understood this expression as a sexual phenomenon. She was 23 years older than he was, and not in a position to create, pardon? Younger, sorry. She was 23 years younger than he was, and not in a position to critique one of the most important forces in the art world in New York City. But she objected strongly to what he said about her art, and I wrote extensively about this in a book called OKeeffe, Stieglitz, and the Critics that was published in 1989. By 1929, OKeeffe was financially independent because he had made her a millionaire by that year on the sale of her work. And when she died in 1986, her estate was worth $70 million. So she did very well for herself with his promotion of her work. And she continued to work with very provocative subjects, such as this image of Narcissa's last orchid. Narcissa was a friend of hers, Narcissa Swift. And these seem to then encourage these sexual attitudes and ideas about O'Keeffe's work. But O'Keeffe had turned away from abstraction in 1923 to present representational forms precisely because she felt that if the forms she presented were recognizable, that no one would mistake them for anything other than the sensuality and sexuality of the natural world, rather than her sexuality and her sensuality. And I think if you compare this orchid with an orchid that is very similar to the one that she portrayed, that she is very accurately depicting what she's looking at, and her art was always tied to forms in the natural world, even her most abstract works. So she had turned to flower painting and to depictions of recognizable form to escape the Freudian interpretations of her work. But in fact, she contributed more to it with these flower paintings. Now, when she got out to New Mexico in 1929, she began her study of landscape in New Mexico with equal interest in realism. And this is a work from 1942 called Black Hills with Cedars. And the Black Hills of Navajo country were among her favorite things to paint. And you can see that it is a depiction of this part of Navajo country, which is about 150 miles west of her house in Abiquiu, New Mexico. This is a photograph taken of the Black Place by Ken Sullen. And then I'm comparing the two of them so you can see. And OKeeffe, when she was there in 42, would be way below down here, so she couldn't see these forms. You'll be surprised if you go out to New Mexico and you stand in front of a very complex series of hills. If you stand right at the bottom of it, you can't see these. So you could see that these rounded forms are exactly what she's painting, what she's depicting. And she works her way back to abstraction through these forms. And that is, they're realistic, but they're also quite abstract. And you see that there are areas within the composition that repeat as forms, and these cloud-like forms in the background repeat, so that you have an abstract component of the painting that synthesizes with the degree of realism. And in New Mexico, she works her way back to abstraction with a work like that, which is Winter Road. And after the 1970s, she doesn't work realistically ever again. And of course, my contention is that she was an abstract painter by instinct, and that she would have pursued abstraction had she not, completely throughout her entire life, had she not been sidetracked by the kind of criticism of her work that she felt was inappropriate to what her work represented. But it doesn't really matter, because we have this great output of work from her. In any case, this is called Winter Road, and I want to show you its origin. And that is, we're looking now at a view from O'Keeffe's bedroom in Abiquiu. And do you see we're looking at the road? Here's the road, and I've driven that road so many times I can't even count it. And it goes around here and then off around that corner to Santa Fe. We're in Abiquiu looking south towards Santa Fe. And if we put them together, you'll see where the inspiration for that image came from. Now, she's always tied to these forms in the natural world, no matter how abstract her work look. And she worked her way back to abstraction by the 1970s when the Whitney decided to have an exhibition of her art. Now let me just show you this image of her, and I'm going to talk more about the Whitney show in just a minute. This is O'Keeffe in New Mexico, and this is a photograph that was made by Maria Chabot in 1930. And Maria Chabot was the person who stayed with her at Ghost Ranch for 4 years when O'Keeffe was there. And Chabot became a very, very good friend of mine. And she allowed me to publish the letters that she and O'Keeffe had exchanged during their lifetime, which was published about 5 years ago. You can see this sporting creature who loves to live in a place that is completely void of trees and water. She's living in the desert, and she's out there as free as a bird and happy as a clam. She loved it. This is where she wanted to live. And in the comparison with the East Coast, I mean, just think about all the trees and the foliage and all of the fauna that go hand in hand with the East Coast, and how this must reveal how painful it was for her to have lived on the East Coast as long as she did. Now I want to show you an image of the 1970 catalog that was accompanying the Whitney show in 1970. During the 1950s and 60s, O'Keeffe was out in New Mexico by herself. She moved there permanently in 1949. 3 years after Stieglitz had died. And she was free to live anywhere she wanted to, and she always knew that she wanted to live in New Mexico. And her art was shown in New York City in the 50s and 60s by her dealer, who was Edith Halpert. But the press pretty much left her on her own. When the Whitney Museum organized its major retrospective of her art, and it was the first one since 1946, so that's quite a long time, OKeeffe's star rose again, and it's primarily because the feminists championed her art, which they associated with parts of her body, and she was once again thrown into the limelight of the New York art world, just as she had been in 1916 when Stieglitz first presented an exhibition of her abstractions. Now, OKeeffe, in spite of the fact that OKeeffe was an ardent feminist and belonged to the National Woman's Party, and was great friends with Anita Politzer, who ran the Woman's Party, or at least she was a secretary for the Woman's Party, was involved with it. It was a party that was the most radical of feminist groups of the time period in the 20s and 30s, and it stayed in operation until 1978. But it believed in the complete equality between the sexes. So the National Woman's Party would not support same-sex-based legislation. In other words, they would not approve of maternity leave for women, unless it was also for men. So they were very radical at the time. And at the time that the 70s show came along, the feminists then celebrated OKeeffe, but she disassociated herself from the feminists because they also said that her work was about her sexuality. And in OKeeffe's mind, it just sounded too much like what the men had written about it in the 1920s, that she was a sexually obsessed woman pouring out her identity into her work. She rejected this, and she had done it since the 20s. And one of the things she did, subsequent to the Whitney show, was she published, and I'm just meant to show you this because she's out in Abiquiu here. She's cooking, and this is part of her, this is in her kitchen in Abiquiu at the Abiquiu house, just to show you how she's out there by herself pretty much. She's never really by herself, but she's out there with people helping her run the house. But this is her own book that was published in 1976. And it's an autobiography without really being an autobiography. Nobody really knows how to classify it because it's so unusual, which is exactly what OKeeffe was all of her life. But it was a crowning component of her efforts to construct an identity for herself that was based on how she wanted to be known. As a self-motivated, highly disciplined, self-created, independent artist who through hard work, self-determination, and perseverance had realized the American dream of self-realization and self-fulfillment. In doing so, she had to distance herself from Stieglitz. Now, in this biography, which is now hard to get, it's out of print, of course, she mentions Stieglitz about 5 times. And she never credits him or acknowledges him for paving the way to her becoming the famous artist that she became. And she doesn't praise him or say anything about the fact that he made her financially independent, or that she had become known through his efforts by the end of the 1920s as one of this country's leading modernists. Nor does she mention anything about Stieglitz's role in her fulfillment, which is pretty much interesting for her to do this. I mean, it's like erasing Stieglitz. Now, this is something that men in artist couples often do, and that is they somehow, and I'm going to be talking in May about Pollock and Krasner, and other artist couples, and the woman is usually erased. In this case, Kahlo became hugely important after her death, and OKeeffe had time during her life to reshape her image the way she wanted to be known. Her biography, this book, sold out almost overnight. And with the notoriety it brought her, she was able to create an image of herself in the press that defined her as she wanted to be known. Serious, uncompromising, and an artist of great integrity. And these kinds of images that I'm going to show you in just a minute were very much in view at the time of the Whitney show. There's also a book that was published in, this is the Georgia O'Keeffe retrospective in 1986, and she also was extremely well known at the time for this very severe image. And this is the kind of figure I'm talking about. And of course, it's very different from the kind of image that Stieglitz projected. Now, the kind of image on the right by Joseph Karsh and others were published in Life and Time and all kinds of magazines and newspapers. So O'Keeffe was able to reshape herself and be the artist in the American mind that she wanted to be. But she felt just a little guilty about erasing Stieglitz, I think, because she knew she had done that. And by the time of her next retrospective, she had spent some time helping organize an exhibition of his work. And this is the 1983 catalog of his work that was held at the National Gallery, which resurrected Stieglitz in the minds of the American public and made him known as the great artist that he was. And this occurred 3 years before her death in 1986. So she brought it completely round. And that is, first he made her famous, and then she erased him for making him famous, and then she brought him back. And in these images that were made in 1944 by Arnold Newman, you see Stieglitz dominating the pair in one image, and O'Keeffe dominating the pair in another image. And this is what I've been talking about. But what O'Keeffe finally did was recognize that there's space on the stage for both of them. And this is how I like to think of O'Keeffe and Stieglitz right now. That they are equally important artists, but O'Keeffe, because of the feminist movement, that O'Keeffe is better known than Stieglitz right now. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any questions. Yeah.